The promise of double pay on New Year's Eve is exactly how they get you to ignore the things that don't feel right. I was standing in the marble lobby of the Blackwood Heights high-rise at 11 o'clock at night, holding a heavy industrial vacuum and a bag of chemical cleaners while the rest of the city was busy pouring champagne and making mistakes. The building manager had been frantic when he called me, claiming that a VIP tenant in the penthouse had trashed the place during an early dinner party and needed it spotless before he returned at 2 in the morning to ring in the new year. It sounded like a standard job for a solo contractor, but as the elevator began its silent, pressurized ascent to the 64th floor, a cold knot started to form in the pit of my stomach. The doors slid open to reveal a foyer that was too quiet, a stark contrast to the distant, muffled thumping of bass coming from the parties on the floors below. I stepped out onto the polished hardwood and realized immediately that the manager had lied about the dinner party. There were no spilled drinks, no scattered plates, and no signs of a celebration gone wrong. Instead, the massive open-concept living room was perfectly staged, except for a single, heavy wooden chair placed directly in the center of the room, facing the floor-to-ceiling windows. As I walked further into the apartment, the city lights below looked like a sea of flickering embers, and I felt a strange sense of vertigo that had nothing to do with the height. I started my work in the kitchen, trying to shake the feeling that I was being watched by the dark corners of the expansive suite. Why would someone pay 3 times the hourly rate for a cleaning service when there wasn't a speck of dust on the counters? It was while I was kneeling down to wipe the baseboards near the air intake vent that I saw a small, rhythmic blue light flickering from behind the metal slats. I pulled a screwdriver from my belt and loosened the vent cover, expecting to find a faulty wire or a piece of forgotten tech, but what I pulled out made my blood turn to ice. It was a high-end smartphone, taped to the interior of the duct, with the camera lens perfectly aligned with the gap in the slats. I tapped the screen, and my heart skipped a beat when I saw that a live streaming app was open, showing a crystal-clear view of exactly where I had been standing moments before. My eyes darted to the top of the screen where the viewer count sat at 1, and a chill ran down my spine when I noticed a chat window at the bottom of the interface. A single message had been sent only 30 seconds ago, and it simply read, "She noticed the vent." I scrambled to my feet, my breath coming in jagged, shallow gasps as I looked around the empty, cavernous room. The realization hit me like a physical blow. The apartment wasn't a residence, it was a stage, and I wasn't the cleaner, I was the entertainment. I dropped the phone and ran for the front door, my boots thudding against the hardwood in a way that sounded deafening in the silence. I reached the heavy mahogany door and grabbed the handle, pulling with all my strength, but it didn't budge. It wasn't just locked. It felt as though it had been electronically sealed from the outside, turning the luxury penthouse into a glass-walled cage. I slammed my shoulder against the wood, screaming for help, but I knew the soundproofing in these high-end buildings was designed to keep the world out, which meant it would also keep my screams in. A low, mechanical hum started to echo through the apartment, and I turned around to see the lights in the kitchen area slowly dimming until only the center of the living room was illuminated. The chair in the middle of the room was now bathed in a harsh, theatrical spotlight, and I realized with horror that the person watching the stream was likely in the building, controlling the smart home system with a tablet. I backed away toward the windows, thinking I could maybe break the glass, but these were reinforced, triple-paned panels designed to withstand hurricane winds. I was trapped 64 stories above the ground with a predator who was playing with the lights like a bored child. Suddenly, the large television on the wall flickered to life, but it wasn't showing a countdown to midnight. It was a split-screen security feed showing the hallway outside the penthouse, and my heart stopped when I saw a man dressed in a dark tactical jumpsuit standing just inches from the door I had tried to escape through. He wasn't moving. He was just standing there, looking directly into the camera with a mask that mimicked a human face, its features frozen in a permanent, uncanny grin. He held up a key card and tapped it against his chin, as if he were waiting for me to do something. I realized then that he wanted me to watch him enter. He wanted the anticipation to be part of the show for whoever was on the other end of that live stream. I ran toward the back of the apartment, searching for a bedroom or a bathroom with a lock, but every door I tried was either jammed or lead to a dead end. I found myself in the master suite, where a second vent was located near the ceiling, And as I looked up, I saw the familiar blue glow of another hidden camera. They were everywhere. The sound of the front door finally clicking open echoed through the suite, followed by the slow, deliberate chime of the entry alert. He was inside. I ducked into the master closet, pulling the heavy door shut and holding my breath until my lungs burned. I could hear his footsteps, slow, heavy, and rhythmic, moving across the hardwood toward the bedroom. Every few seconds, the city outside would erupt with a premature firework, a loud bang followed by a crackle that masked the sound of his movement, making it impossible to tell how close he actually was. I reached into my pocket and realized I had left my own phone on the kitchen counter when I first started the vacuum. I was completely cut off from the world, and the only person who knew I was here was the man currently hunting me through $1 million maze. The closet door began to vibrate as he entered the bedroom, and I could hear him humming a low, tuneless melody that made the hair on my arms stand up. He wasn't rushing. He was savoring the hunt because he knew I had nowhere to go. I looked around the dark closet, my hands frantically searching for anything I could use as a weapon, and my fingers closed around a heavy glass award sitting on a shelf. It wasn't much, but it was all I had. Through the thin crack in the closet door, I saw the shadow of his feet stop directly in front of my hiding spot. The humming stopped. The silence that followed was heavier than the noise, a thick, suffocating pressure that felt like it was crushing my chest. "I know you're in there," he whispered, his voice sounding distorted and metallic through the mask. "The viewers are getting bored of the hide and seek. Why don't we give them the finale they paid for?" He gripped the handle of the closet door, and I felt the tension in the wood as he began to pull. I knew that the moment he opened that door, my life would become a statistic on a dark web forum. I braced myself, gripping the glass award with both hands, waiting for the split second of surprise when the door swung wide. Outside, the clock on the wall began to chime, signaling the start of the final minute of the year. The fireworks began to go off in earnest now, a rapid-fire succession of explosions that shook the very foundation of the building. This was it. I had to move now, or I would never see the first morning of the new year. I was standing on the corner of 4th and Main, shivering as the bitter December wind cut through my coat, watching the sea of people stumbling out of bars in a haze of glitter and cheap champagne. It was 12:15 in the morning on New Year's Day, and the surge pricing on every app was astronomical, but I didn't care because I just wanted to be home and away from the suffocating crowd. My phone screen was cracked, making it hard to see the tiny map, but when a sleek black SUV pulled up to the curb and the driver lowered the window just an inch, I didn't hesitate. I didn't even check the license plate because the cold was starting to numb my fingers, and the man behind the wheel looked professional enough in his dark suit and silver watch. I opened the back door and slid onto the leather seat, exhaling a sigh of relief as the blast of the heater hit my face. And for a second, I felt like I had made the best decision of the night. "Heading to Oak Ridge?" he asked, his voice low and raspy, barely audible over the distant sound of sirens and celebration. I nodded, leaning my head back against the headrest and closing my eyes, not even noticing that he hadn't asked for my name or checked a device. The car pulled away from the curb with a smooth, predatory grace, and I felt the familiar weight of exhaustion settling into my bones as we left the neon lights of the city center behind. It wasn't until we had been driving for 10 minutes that I realized something was wrong. We were supposed to take the highway to get to my neighborhood, but the driver had taken a sharp right into the industrial district, a place where the streetlights were spaced too far apart and the warehouses looked like hollowed-out ribcages against the black sky. I sat up straighter, my heart beginning to pulse in my throat as I looked out the window at the dark, empty lots. "Hey, I think you missed the turn for the interstate. The GPS usually says to go straight here," I said, trying to keep my voice casual, though my palms were already starting to sweat against my knees. The driver didn't respond. He didn't even glance in the rearview mirror, his hands staying perfectly still at 10 and 2 on the steering wheel. I reached for the door handle, intending to tell him to pull over so I could get out, but when I pulled the lever, nothing happened. I pulled it again, harder this time, and then I realized the horrifying truth. The child's safety locks were engaged, and there was no way to open the door from the inside. "The locks are stuck. Can you let me out?" I asked, my voice rising in pitch as panic started to claw at my chest like a living thing. I looked at the back of his head, noticing for the first time how stiffly he sat, his shoulders broad and unmoving. He finally spoke, but he didn't answer my question. Instead, he reached over and turned off the dashboard display, plunging the interior of the car into total darkness. "It's a busy night for disappearances," he muttered, his voice devoid of any emotion. "Everyone is too drunk to notice a car driving the wrong way, and the police are too busy with the rowdy crowds to care about one person who didn't make it home." I felt a cold shiver run down my spine that had nothing to do with the winter air. I fumbled for my phone in my pocket, my heart hammering against my ribs, but when I pulled it out, the screen remained black. The battery was dead. I was trapped in a moving steel cage with a man who was intentionally driving me away from civilization, and I had no way to call for help. I looked out the window again, desperate to see a passing car or a pedestrian, but we were deep in the shadows of the shipping yards now, where the only lights were the red glow of distant radio towers. "Who are you?" I whispered, my breath fogging the window as I backed away into the far corner of the seat. He didn't answer, but he accelerated, the engine of the SUV roaring as we sped down a long, straight stretch of road that led toward the marshes. I realized then that he wasn't just a kidnapper. He was a hunter who had been waiting for someone exactly like me. Someone tired, alone, and distracted by the holiday chaos. I looked at the center console and saw a roll of heavy-duty duct tape and a pair of thick plastic zip ties sitting in the tray. The sight of them made my stomach churn, and I knew that if he stopped this car, I would never get out of it alive. I had to do something, and I had to do it before we reached whatever isolated spot he was heading for. I looked at the back of his seat, searching for a weakness, and I noticed the headrest wasn't fully locked into place. If I could pull it out, the metal prongs might be sharp enough to use as a weapon. I moved as quietly as I could, my movements masked by the hum of the tires on the uneven pavement. I gripped the headrest and pulled upward with all my strength, but it didn't budge. He must have heard the movement, because he suddenly slammed on the brakes, sending me flying forward against the back of his seat. The car skidded to a halt in the middle of a dark, gravel clearing surrounded by tall, dead grass. He turned around in his seat, and for the first time I saw his eyes. They were cold, empty, and fixed on me with a terrifying intensity that made me feel like prey. He reached for the zip ties, his movements slow and deliberate, as if he wanted me to feel every second of the impending terror. "The party is just starting for us," he said, reaching over the seat to grab my arm. I kicked out at him, my boot catching him in the shoulder, but he didn't even flinch. He was stronger than he looked, and his grip on my jacket was like a vice. I scrambled back toward the other door, desperately clawing at the window glass, hoping against hope that I could break it, but it was reinforced. He began to climb over the center console into the back seat, his heavy boots crushing the leather, and I realized I was out of space. I looked at the dashboard one last time and saw the cigarette lighter glowing orange. I lunged forward, grabbing the hot element and thrusting it toward his face with a scream of pure desperation. He recoiled, his hand flying up to protect his eyes, and in that split second of distraction, I lunged for the front seat. I didn't know how to drive a car this big, but I knew I couldn't stay in the back. I scrambled over the gear shift, my heart feeling like it was going to explode out of my chest, and I fumbled for the unlock button on the driver's side door. My fingers found the switch, and the sound of the locks clicking open was the most beautiful thing I had ever heard. I threw the door open and tumbled out onto the sharp gravel, my knees scraping against the ground, but I didn't stop. I ran into the darkness of the tall grass, not looking back, hearing the heavy thud of his boots as he jumped out of the car to follow me. The fireworks were still going off in the distance, beautiful bursts of red and gold that felt like a cruel joke compared to the nightmare I was living. I could hear him breathing behind me, the sound of his footsteps crunching on the dry stalks of grass, getting closer and closer. I didn't know where I was going, but I knew I had to keep moving until I found a light, a person, or a way out of this New Year's trap. The invitation had come through an encrypted messaging app from a contact I hadn't spoken to in years, promising a quick $500 just to work a private security detail for 4 hours on New Year's Eve. I was told the location was a refurbished industrial loft on the edge of the shipyard, and my only job was to stand at the heavy iron door and cross-reference a list of arrivals. It seemed like the easiest money I would ever make, especially since the city was paralyzed by the holiday and no other work was available. When I arrived at 11 p.m., the wind was whipping off the harbor with a lethal chill, and the building looked abandoned, save for a single flickering light above the service entrance. A man in a tailored charcoal suit met me at the door, handed me a tablet, and told me that under no circumstances was I to let anyone in who wasn't on the list, and more importantly, I was never to look any guest directly in the eye. He disappeared back into the shadows of the building before I could ask any questions, leaving me alone in the freezing entryway with nothing but the digital tablet in my hand. I tapped the screen to open the guest list, expecting to see a directory of local socialites or corporate executives, but my breath hitched in my throat when I saw the first few entries. There were no names. Instead, each line was a hyper-specific description of a person's physical traits and what they would be wearing. Entry number 1 read, male, mid-40s, scar on left cheek, wearing a charcoal tuxedo with a red silk pocket square. Entry number 2 was female, early 30s, blonde hair in a tight bun, wearing a vintage emerald gown and a gold choker. It felt less like a guest list and more like a set of instructions for a witness to identify suspects in a lineup. At 11:30, the first car arrived, a black sedan with tinted windows that looked like it belonged to a high-ranking government official. A man stepped out, and as he approached the door, I felt a wave of cold dread wash over me because he matched the first description perfectly, down to the jagged scar that ran from his cheekbone to his jawline. He didn't say a word as he held up a small, silver coin with a strange, geometric symbol etched into the center. I checked him off the list on the tablet, my hands shaking slightly, and he stepped past me into the dark hallway beyond. The silence of the building was unnatural. There was no music, no laughter, and no sound of celebration coming from inside, even though more than a dozen people had arrived within 20 minutes. I began to notice a pattern that made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. Every person who arrived was carrying a small, leather briefcase or a locked metal box, and they all walked with a hurried, nervous energy, as if they were afraid of being seen by anyone on the street. Curiosity finally got the better of me, and I glanced further down the digital list to see how many more people were expected. As I scrolled, I saw a section at the very bottom labeled "The Inventory," and my blood turned to ice when I read the descriptions listed there. They weren't descriptions of guests. They were descriptions of people who were already inside the building. And the very last entry on the list was a perfect, terrifying match for me. Male, late 20s, wearing a black security jacket, brown boots, and carrying the check-in tablet. The realization hit me with the force of a physical blow. I wasn't the security. I was part of whatever was being traded or settled inside that building. I looked toward the street, thinking I could just run into the darkness and disappear, but a second black SUV had pulled up to the curb, and 2 men in heavy coats were standing by the vehicle, watching me with an intensity that told me I wouldn't make it 10 feet. I was trapped between the predators inside and the lookouts outside. I looked back at the tablet, searching for any clue of what was actually happening, and I noticed a small, live icon in the corner of the screen. I tapped it, and the display shifted to a grainy camera feed of the main room on the 3rd floor. The party was nothing more than a circle of folding chairs where the guests I had checked in were sitting in total silence. In the center of the circle was a large industrial scale and a set of documents that looked like property deeds. One of the guests, the man with the scar, was standing up and pointing toward a monitor that showed a live feed of the front door. He was pointing at me. I watched on the tablet as they began to pass around a tablet of their own, entering numbers into a keypad that looked like a bidding interface. I wasn't just on a list. I was being auctioned off as a clean slate for whatever criminal enterprise they were running. likely to be used for a crime I would never be able to prove I didn't commit. I knew I had less than 10 minutes before the auction ended and someone came down to collect their prize. I looked at the heavy iron door behind me and realized it was the only thing between me and the men in the SUV. I had to get inside the building and find another way out, but the hallway was a maze of concrete and shadows. I stepped inside, closing the iron door softly behind me, and began to move toward the back of the structure where I hoped there might be a loading dock or a fire escape. The air inside smelled of damp earth and old grease, and the only sound was the distant, muffled clicking of the guests' tablets from the floor above. I found a narrow set of stairs and began to climb, keeping my weight on the balls of my feet to avoid making the old metal groan. When I reached the second floor, I saw a heavy steel door that was slightly ajar, and I peered through the crack. The room was filled with crates, but what caught my eye was a pile of discarded clothing and several more silver coins scattered on the floor. This wasn't the first time they had done this. New Year's Eve was the perfect cover because the city was too distracted to notice a few people vanishing into the industrial fog. I heard a door open on the floor above, followed by the sound of several people walking toward the stairs. The auction was over. "Where is the new arrival?" A voice boomed from the stairwell, the tone cold and demanding. "He should be at the door." I realized they were coming down to find me, and if they saw the iron door was closed from the inside, they would know I was in the building. I looked around the storage room and saw a small freight elevator at the far end, its gate left open. It was ancient and loud, but it was my only chance to reach the roof or the basement before they caught up to me. I scrambled into the elevator and pulled the gate shut, the metal clanging with a sound that felt like a gunshot in the silent building. I pressed the button for the basement, hoping I could find a sewage tunnel or a service exit that led to the docks. As the elevator began its slow, rattling descent, I looked up through the grate and saw the man with the scar standing at the top of the shaft, looking down at me with a look of predatory calm. He didn't run. He just pulled a small remote from his pocket and pressed a button. The elevator jolted to a violent stop, suspended between the first floor and the basement, leaving me dangling in the dark. The power to the lift had been cut, and I could hear the sound of several men beginning to climb down the emergency ladder on the side of the shaft. I looked at the tablet in my hand, which was still showing the live feed of the room above. The guests were gone, but the man with the scar was still on screen, looking directly into the camera. "You were never the guard," he whispered into a microphone, his voice echoing through the elevator's intercom system. "You were the New Year's resolution for a man who needs a new identity, and we never leave a resolution unfinished." I looked up as the first pair of boots hit the top of the elevator car, and the metal roof began to groan under the weight of the men coming to claim what they had bought.